In this video, I'm going to show you how you can control VCVRack modules using the Pylades module from my plugin and a TouchOSC preset. We'll start by going to the Github page where I have the project. Links will be in the description of the video. And you'll need to download two things. One is the TouchOSC file, which you can get just by clicking on the TouchOSC folder and just download the current available .tosc file. And the other thing you need, until and unless my plugin is available in the VCVRack library, is to download and install the plugin into your VCVRack installation. You can do that by going to the releases page and finding the most recently available version, and then download the plugin version for your computer and architecture. What we'll do is we'll add the Pylades module. Now, because it's OSC, you have to make sure you get a network connection between the two computers, between this computer and the device running your TouchOSC preset, for example, an iPad or an Android tablet. The first thing I'll do is set up a receiver port on this computer, the computer that's running VCVRack. Usually I use like 888.7, for example. Next thing you need is to find the IP address of the computer running VCVRack. For example, on the Mac, you can do that by going to System Settings, going to Network. And if you're going to connect to the TouchOSC device using Wi-Fi, you can go onto the Wi-Fi, click Details, and it will show you your IP address. So you just want to write that down somewhere because you'll need it for the next step. So what we'll do, we'll switch over to our TouchOSC client and show you how we set that up. So here's the TouchOSC client running on my iPad Pro. I've copied the .tosc file onto the iPad using the Explorer on my Mac. Windows is slightly different, but it's all on the documentation site for TouchOSC. So I'm just going to hit the Import tab and find the Pylades .tosc file and load it in. Now I go to the link. Go to the OSC tab if it's not already selected, tick the first connection, and what we do is we now need to type in the IP address that we found just now, which is the IP address of my host computer. So I've already got that set up here. Then you fill in the send port, which is the same port as the OSC receiver port that we just saw on VCVRack, which in this case was 888.7. And then I set up a receive port on this device that's running TouchOSC. And for this, I'm just going to use 8888. Lastly, I need to press that little eye icon, which will show me the IP address of this device running TouchOSC. And again, I need to write this down, 192.168.1.178. I'll just close that. And I'm just going to click done. And now I can just play this preset. You see this is the init screen, and you can see it's now just going to be waiting for a connection. It'll just keep sending a request every few seconds. So switching back, and I'm going to type in the IP address of the computer that was running TouchOSC, which is, if I remember, 178, and importantly set the port to the receiver port on TouchOSC, which is 8888. Now, when I press this button to enable it, you should see in a short order that TouchOSC will find that connection. If it doesn't work first time, sometimes I find just turning on and off the enabling receiver will work. And there we go. Now TouchOSC has established connection, and you can see it's now switched to an empty page, mapping page, because we don't have anything mapped into the Pylades module at the moment. So great. where we're all connected and ready to start controlling our VCVRack. So I'm going to go on to press the select button, and it will show you a grid of all of the modules in this current rack for which we already have a mapping in the mapping library, which is inside the Pylades module. In fact, you can always see that by right-clicking on the Pylades module and going down to the mapping library and looking at the mapping library, and you can see it's got all of these modules loaded. In fact, also the bottom right hand corner shows you how many map modules we've got loaded at the moment. On my TouchOSC, I can press, say, the Mix 8 button. Yeah, this shows the mixer that is now being controlled, and I can just, for example, unmute. And you can see that lovely sequence playing in my rack at the moment. So now I can go ahead and start controlling things. So, for example, I can go back to select and find my tangents filter. I can now use my finger to control the fader to get some nice filter control going on. Maybe I can change the mode of the model running in the Vult tangents module. So I think you can get the idea. The TouchOSC preset is showing you the values reported by the modules and the names of the parameters, all automatically. I didn't have to type all of that in. That's registered by the module automatically. If I go back to the mixer, you can see that, for example, has its parameters reporting the decibel level of each channel fader. The only work I had to do was map this module once, which I'll show you in a minute. And once I've done that and stored it in the library, whichever rack I put that module in, you'll get the same mapping coming up again automatically, and you'll be able to see it in the grid of the rack that you want to have a look at. So for example, I can go down to plateau, and there's a mapping I've done a few weeks ago for the plateau reverb. I can change some of the parameters, pre-delay. Let's go back to tangents. So something else you can do, apart from controlling each parameter, is you can reset it to its default value, whatever the programmer of the module set as that default. So to do that, you hold down the shift button in the bottom left hand corner and double tap the fader that you want to reset. And you can see it's now reset to the default value for that parameter. At the bottom of the TouchOSC preset, you can see that as I've been clicking around parameters, it's been adding the last navigated module to a recent modules list at the bottom. So now I can quickly go and just change the modules that I want to control. It's always one at a time. Each module has up to 6 pages of 36 controls. But I can show you that by going to the Sec3 module, and you can see it has actually got 2 pages mapped, and it shows you along the top how many pages have got mapped control, so you know that there's something there depending on how it was mapped in the first place. The other thing I can do to navigate around is just by pressing the next and previous buttons, which just go left and right, up and down on the grid. When it gets to the end of the row, it will fold over to the next row up or down. So that's the basic controls. But how do we add a new module to our library? I'll take you through that process. What we do, we go to our Pylades module, right click, go down and find the map module select, which allows you to map a single module. You can also auto map the entire rack in one go. Because the problem is that it won't be hand mapped, so the controls may not be in an obvious logical place layout on the 6x6 page grid. So normally I hand map these modules, and this is how to do that, which is exactly the same as using MIDI cat. So I'm just going to, normally what I do is I clear any previous mapping first. I now just go through and click the module I want to map. In this case, I'm going to map slips, algorithmic sequencer. And you can see that Pylades has now got the mappings. Now, what I do on TouchOSC, I just make sure I'm on a page. I press the bottom right-hand clear button, which gives me a nice empty grid of faders and pages. And now I can just go through this list. Now the difficulty is deciding how to lay out the controls on the grid. So just very quickly, I will show you something like, I'll maybe do the root note there, steps there, maybe the scale, start. Now we've got two buttons here, so I might do those underneath. Generate. Then it switches to the prob, so maybe that one, and slips, and then the second button down here. There we are. We have actually now mapped all of the controls on that module. The final step is to add it to our library, so I never have to do that again. So I'll right click and just select add module to library, and it just confirms the name of the module that you're about to add. So if I just click that now, that is now added, and you can see the number of modules mapped has gone up by 1 to 401. And if you want to double check, you can right click and check in the manage library mappings that we've now got a entry for the RSBATech module, which is right down the bottom here. Yeah, so that's the basic flow for each module, but there's other ways of doing it. For example, I can decide to auto map a module. So if it's a really simple module, say this clock module from JW, I can just click this and it's automatically mapped and assigned the first left to right, top down parameters, which looks pretty good to me. So I can just now right click and save that into my library. Then on TouchOSC, if I go back, I can now see, for example, I can see it's now got slips because I've now got a mapping of that, and the clock. Now going to the clock, you can see I've now got that, and I can control the speed, whether the sequencer is running, the clock is running, turn it on and off. There are a lot of options and functions available on the right click menu of the Pylades module. Many of them come from MIDI-cat, so if you're familiar with that, you'll be completely familiar with this. For example, each of the mapped parameters you can select and change the scaling of the mapping so that the full range doesn't go from 0 to 100%, maybe 20% to 40%. So you can decide to do that and change that per parameter per module. You can also choose the precision of feedback back to TouchOSC. You can scroll to the selected module. So if I turn that on, then I'm not showing the TouchOSC here, but I'm just going to go and select bleak and then maybe punch. And you can see that the VCVRack is jumping to center the selected module. So the mapping library is not stored within the module state because it's going to be too big at the moment. It's about 500 kilobytes of JSON. So what the module in the rack does store is the location of the mapping file. So you can have multiple mapping files and switch between them. And to manage that, you right click, and you can also always see the name of the current loaded file, but you can change which mapping library file you want to use. You can save the current mapping library that's stored in memory to another location. you can also do things like export all of the mappings for one plugin, say the Surge plugin, and you can export them to, say, a separate JSON file. And then you could share that with other people who could then import it into their mapping library by doing import module mappings from file. And then you can decide whether to skip any modules that you've already got a mapping for in your library or overwrite. Another feature that is very useful potentially during performance is being able to switch between a rack level mapping and individual module mappings very easily. I can do that by simply clearing all the mappings just by doing right click and clear mappings. Then let's say I want to build some macros, and for example this works really well with the Patchmaster. So if you've already got some Patchmaster rack level macros set up, you can map to those and then save that as a rack mapping. I'll show you how to do that. So I've just prepared TouchOSC. Press the clear button to reset. I'm just going to randomly pick some parameters I might want to add a rack level mapping for. Let's say this one, so it can be from different modules. Let's say the pulse width of from Bleak, and I don't know, maybe the number of steps on this sec3. We'll put that on there. So I've got a little example of 4 macro mappings for the rack. What I'm going to do is going to right click, and I'm going to, instead of saving that as a module as we did before, I'm going to save that as a rack level mapping. Now I've done that, what I can do on TouchOSC is switch between that and individual modules. So for example, I go select and say Mix 8. That's the full Mix 8 module mapping that we've seen already. But now if I press the rack button, it now has applied. Let me just scroll that through so you can see it actually on Pylades. You actually have to look at it on the module. You can see it's now switched back to the rack mapping, and I can now control those specific parameters just all on one page and without having to navigate to individual modules. But if I want to, I can, because I can just press select. One thing you really must remember to do is that the rack mapping is not stored in the mapping library, but it's stored in the rack, in this rack definition itself. So I'm just going to save that. So every time I open this rack up and then press the rack button on TouchOSC, it will show up those same controlled mappings again. Finally, I just want to close out just by pointing you back at the Git repo, because I have got documentation on the module, which includes information about how to use the TouchOSC preset and the rack module itself, and a getting started guide, which is just goes through pretty much what I've just covered on this video, but you can look at that in more detail. One thing it does show, there is a page that has a list of all of the plugins that I have hand mapped modules for the given version of the plugin. Other people are very welcome to create their own mappings and use the export facility so that I could add them to the factory library so that everyone else could get access to those. I hope you find this useful, and look forward to hearing what you're doing with it. Thank you very much.